Wow. Okay, cool. Yep, I hear myself. Cool. Hi, everybody. It is so wild to do this again. I haven't done this in a while, so I'm very jazzed. Y'all are amazing. I love seeing all your little eyes. Oh, awesome. Yeah, thank you so much to the Game UX Summit folks for having me here. It's just been an energizing day, and I'm going to do my best to kind of just I'm going to have a lot of energy on the stage today. So what a great introduction to myself. So you heard about these wonderful 3 jobs that I have. I don't know if I need to explain any of these more. Actually, I think I want to add a couple of little notes. So thank you to Bungie for actually sponsoring the Game Devs of Color Expo. We actually had it last week, and I don't know if anybody actually attended it, but if you did, yeah, a little woo, I heard you. And my favorite thing about the Game Devs of Color Expo, which, as was said, is in its 7th year as of last week, is that we get to give out money to game devs. So we gave out $90,000 in game development grants, no strings attached, which is amazing. That thing keeps me going. So as you can see, this is the title of my talk, and that is an example of something that I do that gives me lots of meaning. So other things of note, let's just get into it. It's really good to see all of you. I don't know, is this anybody else's first one of these in a while? Yeah, right? Feels cool. Maybe do a little wiggle dance. Can we do some wiggle dances? It's been awkward for anybody else with me. Yeah, awkward? Okay, cool. I really appreciate you all for coming here today to be a part of this. It's just really encouraging and exciting to see. All right, so I just did all this excited woo-woo-woo, but I'm also going to be, as I said, talking about something that is pretty real, it's pretty personal, and I hope that some of what I share today resonates with y'all. So I'm going to be talking about what it is like to have a bit of an existential burnout experience, especially as somebody who's, as was said, been in design for 12 years or so. And for those of you who don't know, I actually started doing creative work as a kid. So I always knew I wanted to be an artist. I always knew I wanted to do something creative. I always knew that I wanted to do something even also video games related, which is how I ended up with my 3 jobs. So I was able to figure out a way to go from the depths of a really weird time and kind of come back and actually turn into something a little bit different than what I was before 2020. So we'll talk about how to get through that and then figure out what's next. It's a keynote, so I'm going to try to keep it, light and silly while also kind of being wow, that was weird. So we were all there. We all know that it was a weird time. It's still kind of a weird time. There are all still things that are happening all of the time that are very strange and hard, and we're working to navigate. And I feel these things have been happening for a number of years, but I really feel like it came to a head in 2020. For me, that happened because I had started a new job. I was there. I had been in the industry in 2020 for about 10 years, and I just started this new position at a company that is called Asana. They do task management. I don't know if anybody here likes Asana or uses it. I saw some nods there. Thank you for using the software that I helped design. But yeah, I started this new job, and I was really excited. I started in January of 2020, and I was like, finally, I'm a staff designer. I'm going to get to work on this 0-to-1 project, and I'm going to show everybody blah, 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 blah. And then March happened, and I was just like, whoa, okay. How do I do this? I don't know. We all know the story pretty well about what went down. As I said, we were all there. I was in New York. I imagine for those of you who are local, it was probably also a very weird time. And I felt very, very existential, kind of honestly hearing in the background of my day-to-day Zoom calls all of these ambulances and sometimes looking out the window, and there were protests going on, and I was like, dang. I am in these Zoom calls getting my work critiqued, and all these people are, out there helping people in a way that feels really tangible. And this was especially exacerbated for me because, as I said, 0-to-1 project. And it turns out that when you're working on a 0-to-1 project, the amount of impact that you feel like you're making, at least when I was working on this project, there was a lot of guessing, a lot of hypotheticals, and I wasn't getting to talk to very many people directly. So I was really feeling like I was just in my own little bubble with these other Zoom chat heads, and it just made me feel like I was working on software that didn't matter. I was also looking like this a lot of the days. Is this like, yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, that was me. I was just kind of laying there when I wasn't working, just kind of like, fuck, the world sucks right now. And like, there was just all this news on like Twitter and every source, and like, New York Times was just shouting things at me every day. And it was just creating this really bad cycle for myself. So yeah, this was the fact. It was not very good for my productivity at my full-time job, nor as a game developer or organizing an event that like 1,500 people show up to digitally, or it used to be in person, and we had to figure that whole thing out also as this was happening. So as an aside, the Game Devs of Color Expo used to be an in-person event. We had about 750 or so people show up in 2019, and then the whole thing got very weird and very confusing, and we weren't sure. We were hearing like, oh, by September, this whole thing will be over. And we were like, is that true? Like, we don't know. So I both had to figure out, what to do in my day job. I had to figure out how I was gonna keep this event going. I had to figure out how I was gonna be a productive creator. So for me, what this looked like at my day job is that I would get questions about like, oh, should the button be primary or secondary? And I'd just be there like, what the hell? Like, what are we doing? Like, I'm afraid for my safety, and I have to like think about if it should be blue or white. I don't know. And then it's like, what about the user flow? Like, my democracy is at risk. I don't know like why this thing matters at all. I just literally don't understand, because like the world is on fire, and I'm being told that I need to reduce friction by like this tiny amount. So obviously not in a good place, and I know that these things matter now, but for me at that point in time, this was 100% my mindset. And as I said, I was working on software also, which is not like a wicked problem, per se. And like wicked problems are like things like solving world hunger, curing viruses and things like that. And I was seeing people use design for the purpose of resolving these challenges, especially the folks who were, I think there was a person whose nickname was like Vax Daddy or something like that. Like, that was a tech person who like was able to use skills to actually provide access and information to people at a really important time. And so I was like, ooh, should I be doing that? Why am I not doing these kinds of things? And then, as I kind of alluded to, I was also having some challenges with my creative projects. So I was thinking like, okay, well, like I could make games, I could draw. Like, as I said, I've always been a very creative person, but should I be doing that right now? I don't know. So I felt very overwhelmed. I was feeling very helpless, and I would like to just check. Did anyone else feel like that at any point in time in the past, like 2 years? Yeah, cool, I see you. I'm with you. You are my people. So the reality is that I'm not rich, so like I couldn't stay in that place for very long, right? Like I need to eat and I need to pay rent. So I was like, all right, cool. Like I hear you, self, and also like I can't unfortunately afford to take like, a year off. Like I totally respect anybody here who did that. I'm like jealous of you, but like I couldn't do that. So I had to figure out a way to actually continue to do my work. I mentioned I had literally joined a company 3 months beforehand, and I had, for some reason, volunteered to do that 0 to 1 project. And it was a new major business venture for the company, so I had to not just like show up and like check into the job, but I actually had to like do the job pretty well. So I'm gonna talk through some of the things that I did during this time to actually start to re-engage and find excitement within the work that I was doing. So the first thing is I had a wonderful therapist. Shout out to therapists. They are very helpful for talking through your challenges, especially when you're in some major world events. So I wrote down a lot of my feelings all of the time. Every single day I was just like, how am I feeling today? wrote down some, random feelings, and then I would list out like, why am I feeling this way? And over time, I was able to actually notice some patterns and some triggers and figure out some next steps. Now, what I recognized is, as I told you before in my story, I've always been a very creative person. And so I knew that it wasn't that like the work I was doing was directionally not right for me. It's just that there was something else that was going on that was in relation to just feeling like I was out of control. And for me, that really came down to this feeling of disconnection. So I was feeling really stuck. And I hadn't learned anything in a pretty long time. It had probably been at that point about a year and a half maybe. And so I was in this place where I was not just, experiencing all of this world stress, but I also wasn't growing as a person. I had this new label at my job, but at the same time, it didn't really feel that different. And I don't know if you've experienced this when you start at a new job. Like sometimes it's like, oh, or like a new title, it's like, oh, this is different. And it's like, is it actually that different? I don't know. Like it's still there. So I had to think of ways to actually start to get back in control and to actually start growing and learning and kind of, take control of my career a little bit. And then, when it came to COVID and, all of the world news that was happening around me, I wanted a way to, stay aware of what was happening, but I also, recognized that I needed to figure out a healthy way to exist with all of those things. So I reconnected with myself, and I did that in a variety of ways. Now, one thing I want to very specifically call out that I actually learned about like 2 weeks ago and wish I knew about 2 years ago is this concept that's called the 7 types of rest. And it's a concept that is by Dr. Sandra Dalton-Smith. And gosh, seriously, great idea, actually thinking about the different types of rest. So I'm going to explain them, and I hope that you, if you have a notebook or something, like as I explain them, feel free to write down the types that resonate the most with you. So we've got physical rest, which, taking time off, laying in bed, doing nothing. Those are great things. That's physical rest. I feel like it's the one that a lot of people know about. There's also mental rest. So if you have this feeling that your brain is just like a flat pancake, it's mush, which is very common in user experience, especially because we're just solving really crunchy problems of many varieties and having to explain to people who maybe don't get it and getting buy-in from stakeholders, and all of that can combine to this feeling of just like, I am completely spent. Like my brain is tired, my body is not, but I can't function. So that's mental rest, and that's why you need it. There's also social rest, which, after this conference, we're all gonna need a lot of that because we are talking to so many people. And I feel like I got a lot of that. I think we all had a lot of that. So, I didn't need that as much, but surely mental rest, so big. There's also sensory rest, which is, there's lots of sounds, lots of lights, like visual overwhelm. And so if you're experiencing that, it can be really nice to, ignore screens, go outside. Certainly was feeling that. There's also emotional, which is, feeling emotionally overwhelmed. Maybe you're experiencing a lot of, or you're hearing about a lot of bad things, and you need to, find a way to kind of rest and maybe kind of recuperate before you can take in any more negative information. There's also spiritual and creative, which are the final two. And so spiritual rest, there's lots of ways to interpret the word spiritual, but one of them is about purpose and meaning. And for me, as I was describing before, you could see that I was not really sure of what my purpose was. And then when it comes to creative rest, that's like artist's block, writer's block, things of that nature. And for those, it can be really good to learn things. It can be really good to, kind of like sit within yourself and think. And so I'm actually going to talk through 5 different particular focus areas that I ended up digging into during this time, because for me, I needed physical, I needed mental, sensory, emotional, spiritual, and creative rest. So everything except the one we all had, which was social. All right, so firstly, breaks. I took a lot of breaks within the span of mid 2020 to honestly up to a couple of months ago. So for those of you who don't know, one of the things that I did between my previous job at Asana, which I left, I think, in April or so of this year, and now, or June, when I started my new job at All Turtles, I actually took 2 complete months off. And that was an example of kind of rest that are really helpful. But there's other kinds of breaks that you can also take, again, if you cannot afford to take months off at a time. So one thing I did is I drew a bunch, and I didn't pressure myself to, draw something super fancy or anything like that. I just kind of looked at still lifes, and I just focused on the world around me. I also stopped pressuring myself to do things like make a game within the span of a couple of weeks or a year or anything like that, because for me, games are really a creative practice, and I want to re-engage, but I don't want to be on other people's timelines. So I got really comfortable with just putting things down for months at a time in terms of my games. But when it came to my job, what I did is I would, for example, set specific times every single workday where I would go for a walk 3 times a day. And so, for example, if you're working at home, you can say, I have lunch at this point in time. I'm going to spend 10 minutes of my lunch break just going around the block. And literally for me, something about that just really helped me. So I started walking 3 times a day, just going in a different direction around different blocks and kind of seeing the little things that were changing every single time I went outside. And then finally, one thing I was able to get done, because the companies that I've worked at recently have unlimited PTO. I don't know if any of you have that, but shout outs to unlimited PTO. I was able, I was able to take 3 weeks off at the end of the year. Super great, really helped somewhat. Not perfect, but gosh, it got me from negative 20% back up to 15%. So the second one is boundaries. So I think we've all had an exercise in boundaries. For myself, that looked maybe a little differently because I'd worked at places where there were massive boundary oversteps, and I'd had to learn over time how to kind of push back against those. But what I mean by that is doing things like, not using social media all of the time, because every time I logged into it, it made me feel absolutely outraged. I also got really good at using mute words, for example, on Twitter. If you don't know about mute words, you gotta go check them out. They are amazing. I did not use a service like Block Party, but gosh, I wish that I did. If you know about Block Party, you know what I'm talking about. But yeah, I really sat and thought about my relationship with social media. And for me, that was incredibly helpful. And another thing I did, for example, is that I started consuming news through much slower formats like traditional media and RSS feeds. So I don't know if anybody here loves RSS feeds or knows what those are, but you used to, I see you used to be able to just go on a website, there's a little link that says get the RSS feed, you can subscribe to it, and then you can kind of, just get a slower drip of content versus, the New York Times shouting at you. So that was great. And then when it comes to to my job, I did actually do some things that were related to setting expectations with collaborators about my outputs, especially in times of stress. So I told folks, hey, I understand that you want me to mock up X, Y, and Z, but realistically, here's the capacity that I have for the rest of this week. And, if you want these mock-ups, let's focus on particular sets of parts of the experience that are really important, and I will put so much of my energy into those, and then for the rest of them, can we kind of, maybe not phone it in quite, but where do we actually really need to put our energy? And that was really helpful because, then they're like, oh, Kat, wow, you're really helping us prioritize. And I'm like, cool, my brain is not gonna be mush by the end of the day. So it's a win-win for everybody. And it also taught me the value of really helping other people understand, what my job is and how much mental work it takes to do it. So that was really helpful for the team. And all of this really helped me to reclaim my agency. I did actually somewhat, reframe my relationship with my work because, I care a lot about the things that I do, and I want to make sure that I'm delivering a quality, and I was able to advocate so that I could deliver the quality that I would be proud of while also understanding and setting expectations about what I was going to actually be able to deliver at that point in time. It also showed me that my work was something that I did have some level of choice in, and the nice thing is that we are seeing this trend more broadly with employees feeling more agency and more control and power. Shout outs to unions, they are great, and I hope we see more of those. But yeah, being able to say that you're selling your labor, you're selling high quality labor to your employers, and making sure that you want to do a good job, but maybe it's not like a life or death situation, and that's something you might choose to do. So for me, it was really helpful to set boundaries with my employer and set boundaries in terms of the news that I was consuming and figuring out ways to actually do that without overwhelming myself. The next thing that I did is I dug very deep into education. So I'm going to share a couple of classes or groups that are really valuable for design practitioners. And then I'm also going to share an example of a completely other thing that I did, because I think that it's really valuable to not just dive into learning about what's in your direct area of expertise, but also trying something that's completely different, because you never know how the paths are going to overlap. So, firstly, if any of you are struggling to explain the business value of the work that you do, Business Essentials for Designers from Designer Fund was super duper helpful for me. And this is something that I did pretty early on. I think it must have been maybe September of 2020 or so. And gosh, it completely reframed the way that I think about business lingo, for example. So the number one thing that I learned is that a lot of the back end of business, at least the way it was presented in this class, was guesstimation. So I thought that people talking about words like the TAM. Does anyone know what the TAM is? Total addressable market. That is just guessing. It's like how many people in the world maybe want to buy mattresses. And then based on this approximate number, we think we will earn $6 billion. Like that is what a lot of business conversations are like. But what was really helpful for me is understanding, how to actually use that kind of knowledge to pitch the design initiatives that I think are important. Because then I can say things like, oh, well, accessibility or design systems work will have this kind of impact on this numbers of people. And if we make that impact on this number of people, then maybe this percentage of people will not drop off and they will actually convert better. And then you can have really valuable conversations. So I really loved this class, and it really helped me feel both more engaged in my work, and it also made me feel less pressure, because I recognized that, nobody has all the answers, and so many of the companies that, we hear about these days, they started with a ton of guesstimation. So that was really cool. Another class that I took was a super high class about project management, super HI, for those who might be curious. And this was very directly applicable to my work. And another one that I really liked was called On Deck Design. And I don't know, do folks know about On Deck Design here? Oh, cool, we got a handful of people. Okay, cool. Yeah, so On Deck Design, for those of you who don't know, is basically a combination of conversations like this, where you have like an expert come up and kind of talk about something interesting, like how to manage a team of designers, for example. But then it also gets into conversation about navigating your career. So you actually have these group therapy sessions that are called, I think they're called like masterminds or something like that, where you get to meet with designers, approximately 6 or so designers, for every 2 weeks, 6 weeks in a row. And you just get to kind of vent about some of the challenges that you're experiencing. So I really found this useful because, again, I was kind of at a point where I was trying to figure out how to move forward with my work. And I love to see the progression of other people, as it made me realize that I wasn't alone in this confusion that I was feeling. So I highly recommend, this isn't the only version of this concept, but like design team group therapy is actually incredibly useful if you're at a point where you're trying to figure out what's next for your career. I also recommend coaching. If you don't have a career coach, I really recommend looking into a career coach because that was also something that I realized I needed after On Deck. And then finally, my swerve was into a program about angel investing. And I was lucky enough to be able to get into this program, and the work that I do in terms of giving out grants to game developers, I really wanted to figure out how I could maybe extend that to people of color who want to come up with startup ideas. So on a whim, I just saw this newsletter that said, hey, we're gonna have this program, it's called Pipeline Angels. And I was like, I don't know what that is, but seems cool. Let me try it out. And then it turned out that that overlapped really well with my next role, which was at All Turtles. So I had no idea that that kind of shift was going to happen in my brain, but it's wild sometimes how the classes that you might just take on a whim or the information that you learn on a whim might lead to something that can drive you into your next position. So I really like the idea of kind of going with your gut a little bit. If you see something cool, try it out. And then I also became part of something bigger. So as I mentioned, the things that I was doing I was definitely trying to participate in some level of community. Like I was on Discord, I was playing Just Dance with my friends and stuff like that. But I still was feeling like I wasn't really very connected to people. And so I had to figure out a way to feel a little bit like an ant in a way, being part of something bigger, moving toward a collective whole. So I did that in a couple of ways. For example, a lot of them were like more about my local community than just the work that I was doing, because in some way, having the balance between, like thinking about the world around me and the work I do as a design practitioner really helped me feel like I was actually, doing good work in my day job too, and I was helping people in a unique way. So some things that I did in this regard were I signed up to knock on doors for candidates that I liked. I joined a local political association and just kind of talked about some stuff with them. I did election work, which is what this is a drawing of. These are my notes from the election work that I did, which is really cool because I learned a lot about the systems behind the United States and how our voices are heard and things of that nature. And that was really helpful because I think at that time I was really struggling to see the purpose and the meaning in all of the things I mentioned before. And then more directly applicable to my day job, I actually signed up to mentor a designer. And all of these things together really helped me feel, more connected to my community. The designer I mentored was actually local to me, and so we were actually able to meet up, and we connected, I think, for about a year and just talked every couple of weeks. And again, I could see her progression, and that made me really, feel like I was contributing to something. So yeah, that was really good, especially as somebody designing a 0 to 1 project. I didn't have that at that point in time. And the most I was able to do was to, put my work in front of a couple of people. They kind of guessed if it was going to be helpful or not. So having these direct connections with people was huge. And then finally, accountability. So I don't know if other folks are doing this right now, but for me, especially both creatively and as a designer in my games work and as a UX designer, I really needed a way to have people around me and to have this accountability sense, which was missing for me as I was figuring out how to do that work at home. So I did a lot of what is called game dev buddy time for the game development work that I was doing. And what that looked like is I would schedule time with friends, maybe about an hour or 2 hours, and I would just say what I was gonna do at the beginning and then see where I got by the end. And this was great for me for both these game dev projects, and I also extended this into my work as a designer. So I would say, hey, I have this task, and I just need somebody to sit there with me, and we'll both just work on our things quietly, and then let's talk about where we got at the end. Super surprising how far you can get with this kind of thing. So I highly recommend this. Sometimes I've heard it called like power hours. I think there are actually startups now that are trying to make this a product. Good luck, but yeah, they're trying. There's always some productized thing. So through this experience, I learned a lot about myself. Evanescence reference for anybody who gets it. I really started to feel more like a normal person again, and like the me that I've always been, again, just a little bit different. And it helped me to reduce the pressure I was putting on myself. And it told me, I can't really control the world around me, but I can control how I react and, how I take in information, and I can adjust that. I still, as I said, I want to know what's going on, but what are other ways that I can go about that don't, trigger me or make me feel like there's nothing I can do? So that was huge. It also made me recognize that, the work that I do has a positive impact after all. It was really nice, honestly, after the product I was working on released, because I could start to also get customer feedback. We had a little form where we had a button where you could send some feedback in, and people would just be like, wow, this button is so confusing, I could not find it. And I was like, oh, actually, it does matter if the button's primary or secondary. Cool, I'm gonna change that now. So that was awesome. And I have to say, customer feedback, huge. Thanks to the user researchers and the research folk that we heard from today. It is so important to get customer feedback regularly. So for me, I was able to start seeing value by mentoring people. After the product I was working on came out, I could see it through that too. But really trying to find different ways to get that human connection feeling was really important. And my dad said something also that was pretty nice, which is, you may not be a virologist, or you may not be a politician or a lawyer or something like that, but you're contributing value to the bigger picture. And I was able to see that through things like the Game Does with Color Expo and all the other pieces of work that I do, especially mentorship and connecting with people. So I'm grateful, and I just needed to recognize that my value looks different from other people's. And something else I recognized is that I'm on my own timeline. I'm more comfortable, as I said, with taking a lot longer of a time to accomplish certain things. I had a game that came out a couple of years ago. People were very excited about it, and I was like, oh man, I gotta work on the next big thing. And I just realized, it's okay if it takes 5 years, which it will, because I like to work on web games in JavaScript by myself. Not a good combination for coming out with a game in a year. So I stopped comparing myself to other people, and I just decided I'm going to do things in my own way. And, I still do have to say I compare myself sometimes. We all look at LinkedIn and see all the new jobs, and we're like, dang it. But yeah, besides that, I do a pretty good job now. Also, again, that business class really taught me that we're just guessing. So much of this stuff is guessing and hypotheses and validating which hypotheses work and which ones don't. So what this culminated in for me, obviously the Game Does with Color still exists. Really glad we still do that. And I still make games. But the thing that I did end up changing is that I am a people manager now. So for the first 12 years of my career, I was very hands-on, and over time I recognized that the thing I have been running away from in a way is community design. I love doing that stuff. I literally make a conference every year. But I think I wanted to be seen as a hands-on practitioner because, I don't know, I just really wanted that feeling of, being a principal, whatever. And maybe one day I will actually do that again, I don't know. But I love people, and I love designing systems for people. And at my heart, I am a service designer, and management is a great way to actually design services directly for people and see the impact every day. So I've been doing that since June of this year. And I'm so proud that I get to design systems that support 6 incredibly talented people. So for me, that was a really big change, and I've just been having a blast. And all in all, what I can say is that I'm still healing, for sure. Some days I definitely do have the 20% out of 100 energy level. Some days I'm definitely at 0, but most days I would say I'm probably at 80, which is a huge improvement. And I think it's going to be a continuous journey. And I think that, if there's anything that I've learned, and I'm sure many of you in this room have learned, it's that this is a long-term effort and that you need to listen to your bodies. So I'm going to leave you with 3 messages that I hope you will take into your lives as wonderful UX practitioners and creative individuals, multifaceted humans, and a pack of eyes, in case any of you need to hear them, because we all love repetition as well. So firstly, you can only control what is in your control. I really like a practice that one of my reports does. It's kind of counterintuitive, but she goes into the forest sometimes and is just, at the will of the earth. And for her, that's really helpful because then she recognizes that work decision that's out of my control, not so bad. Those stakeholders, they're just kind of messy and we can't really, manage or figure out how to navigate that fully. And they kind of just need to go do their thing. Okay, come at me, Earth, And I think that it can be really helpful to think that way. You can control what you can control, you can influence to a certain amount, but beyond that, sometimes you need to just move with the change. And I hope that you all remember that if you ever have really annoying stakeholders. The second one is you are contributing value in your own way. So there's lots of ways you can take this. I personally took it in way of, I was struggling in terms of figuring out am I doing enough useful stuff? We're all unique. We all have unique talents. And, thinking about UX, for example, there's visual designers, there's service designers, there's user researchers. They all come together. They make amazing things, right? Your contributions don't need to look like other contributions. And that can be wonderful. And, I hope you don't all pressure yourselves to be something that you're not. For example, with video games, right? Games are so powerful. Games are a thing that got me, and I'm sure many of you, through some really isolating times. And I've been playing a ton of Splatoon 3, for example, and it's just so amazing. And after a hard day of managing stakeholders, it is so nice to come home and just splat some paint all over the place and explode, my friends. So I think that it's important to remember that, regardless of what you're doing, it has meaning, and hopefully you're proud of that and you get to actually talk to people and experience, how they see the work that you're doing. And then finally, you are on your own path. Your path is very unique. It may have many branches. You may not always see exactly how everything's going to come back together, but sometimes, things just work out in a really strange way. And you may not look exactly, your path may not look like the LinkedIn resumes and stuff like that. That's okay. Just kind of see if you like where you're going. If you don't, adjust, keep learning, and you'll find, a little bit more direction. And with that, I appreciate all of you. Thank you for going with me on this talk journey. And thanks for being a part of my first talk since February of 2020 in person. Wild stuff. Live long and prosper. How do we do this with the hands? There we go. Thank you. Questions? What kind of existential questions are we going to have?
Amazing talk, Kat. Thank you
Thanks.
so much. Okay, so there's a bunch of questions.
Wow.
The first one is pretty simple to answer. It's pretty technical. You mentioned Business Essentials by Designer Fund, but people can't find what it is through Google. So is it a paid course, a video, a blog, something else?
Oh yeah, well Designer Fund is Designer Fund they don't always do that course, and so it kind of depends. Other courses, again, On Deck Design actually does have parts of it that cover the same topic, so I would recommend On Deck. And the way that On Deck works is they have this huge library of past content from speakers. So I swear I'm not sponsored by them, but actually that was a great backup, and they talk about, the business case for design and things like that as well. So I would recommend that.
So now for a more difficult question. From Doug, do you have any advice from someone who wants to assert boundaries at work, but worries about jeopardizing their position, losing their job via these requests?
Yeah, I think that there's a variety of ways of setting boundaries. One thing I try to think about and I try to get from other people before I set my boundaries is to understand what their outcome, like what outcome they're looking for. And that can be helpful because it can give you a point of negotiation. So you can ask a person like, okay, well, like, what are you hoping to see? And if their answer is like, well, we really need to have this work done by the end of the week, then you can ask more questions like, okay, well, like, what part of this do you need done by this week? What fidelity of thinking do you need? What is this going to be used for? And for me, I think, digging into the why of the people around you is really valuable. So I think there's like a variety of ways you can set boundaries. If you're talking individuals who are asking you for things, then, starting to dig into their reasons for asking you those questions is valuable. And then from there, you can negotiate with them without compromising yourself. I think when it comes to the broader question of setting boundaries at work, when it's more complicated, for example, like if you're being taken advantage of in like a role that's like not paying you enough or something like that, that can get obviously more complicated. I'd like to, in those cases, usually ask like, questions around what does career progression look like? Hey, like I noticed, industry-wide information about, people in my role and pay and things like that. So it kind of depends on like what you mean by boundary setting, but there are certainly ways to do it without losing your job.
So a few people are wondering, one, can your lead be your career coach? Does it have to be someone external? And two, does it have to be a certified coach or can it be a mentor from the industry?
Yeah, the first part of the question was...
Can your lead be your...
Oh, can your lead be your coach?
Career coach?
Yeah, I mean, those are mentors and coaches are kind of different. Like sometimes coaches may not even be, like for me, my coach is like an operations person and she's not traditionally a designer, but she works with designers across a variety of companies. And so I think that's the important thing about a coach. Ideally, they are an external coach because they are seeing broad trends. Somebody who's your mentor who works at the company is just not going to have quite the same perspective as somebody who, sees outside of your company. But if you can't afford a coach, take anything you can get. Yeah.
How do you find a mentor?
Ooh, how do you find a mentor? I think that it's hard because like you don't always want to just go up to someone and be like, can you be my mentor? Like that doesn't always work. I think the way that I've found mentees is something that I can talk about. And usually it's been like somebody that I see potential in. I think that a lot of it can kind of organically happen by talking at events like this and, coming up to somebody and asking questions. Like, to me, that's been the easiest way is like somebody asks me questions that show that they're excited and interested about the things that I'm excited to talk about for hours on end. And they just keep asking questions and I just keep giving answers. And then, either one of us might ask like, oh, do you want to like meet up to chat, in the future? And then if you can create that semi-regularity, you've got yourself a mentor without asking.
Is there a question in the audience? We can bring the mic to you over there. So while Jen is going over there, are there examples where you had to reconcile your breaks, boundaries with requirements of your job or deadlines? How did you find helpful ways to deal?
Yeah, I've definitely had times where there have been projects that like are very demanding. And I think what I've had to do in those cases where it's like, I know I need time off, but I maybe can't take the full time off at that moment, is I've usually like tried to schedule some breaks around projects or like schedule a day here or there. For example, like if there's a holiday on a Monday, I'll schedule a Friday and just try to put little incremental types of breaks around for myself. I think also, I'm trying to think of other things that I did when I worked on this 0 to 1 mess of a project. I mean, I definitely remember like being pretty honest with people when I just like energetically wasn't there, and I would renegotiate expectations relatively often. So I would say, hey, like I know that we said, that we wanted to deliver giant big things, but like which parts of these, again, need to be in like really high fidelity? Which ones can we use the design system for example, and not, have me spend all this energy illustrating if we don't actually need it. So I think there's ways to be creative about the boundary setting and advocating for the rest that you need. It can be hard, of course, if you have deadlines. I think I often ask people, like, are these deadlines actually real? And I know that can be difficult with this audience, for example, because there are many consumers who have a lot of expectations and, these date announcements happen in advance. But yeah, I think for me, a lot of the negotiation, or a lot of what it's looked like is for sure negotiating the outputs and setting expectations with folks in terms of my capacity. And to me, that's a form of boundary setting as well. Or saying, hey, after this project is over, I'm gonna need, a week off. Like, you can kind of predict things as well, and that can also be your form of boundary setting. Question.
There we go. Hi, my name is Rochelle. How did your mindset change shifting from individual contributor to being a manager? And what was that process like for you?
Gosh, great question. So I think that for context, so this is my second time technically managing. I did the first time 6 years ago, and I was managing 2 interns. And I don't know if anyone here has managed interns, but it is very different from managing senior people. And my takeaway from that time at the time was oh, management's too hard, it's too complicated teaching people how to work. And so I just put that over there, and I was let me just be a hands-on designer. So I think what I learned from that time though was definitely that it's a completely different job, and you are 100% right. You really got to shift your brain to shift into management, and a lot of that is because you're scoping sometimes work for other people, especially if they're more junior. And then when it comes to managing senior people, you have to learn to get out of the way, which is not easy a lot of the time for people. And you're thinking again about building systems for people to thrive in and do quality work. So you're thinking more about standards and things like that. And the nice thing about being a staff or a lead designer is that it can be a progression to get to the point where you can potentially think about things in the way that a manager might. Now I caveat that because there are some people who just don't have interest in management, and that's totally fine, and you should totally be a mega distinguished IC and stay that way. But I think that there are some folks who, you start to see them mentoring people and building communities and organically, seeing the threads across companies. And that, when that starts to happen, that is the shift that, for me at least, showed me that I was ready to enter management. I got to a point where I was literally frustrated with org design, and I was what am I doing? I was supposed to be thinking about button colors and user flows and stuff like that. So yeah, I think for me the big shift was I started caring more about the design of the organization than the design of the outputs, which as a note I do still care about. But yeah, I notice the people around me, and I critique the design of the organization, and I now am able to design career ladders and things of that nature, and it's really compelling. Yeah. Other questions?
Other questions in the room? So I have a question. When you feel desperate and the world is a difficult place, you mentioned many things you can do. Where do you start? Do you start with introspection? Do you feel you need to start with a community? What do you think is the most useful to get out of there?
Yeah, that's a good one. I do think it's important to level set and understand what is happening inside of you, because then once you kind of list out how you're feeling that day, so if I'm feeling anxious and I can say well, why am I feeling anxious? And then I can write out all the little things. Then I can start to think about what are things that I would do to counteract that. So if I'm feeling stressed about, work, for example, and oh, somebody said something that kind of frustrated me, then it's okay, close the laptop, go outside. So I do think that breaks can be a really great first thing to do. But yeah, if you're feeling creatively, drained or something like that, then that's definitely for me where I've said, okay, like I need to learn something, or maybe I need to go to like a figure drawing class or like something to just have somebody tell me what to do. Like half of it is just, I want somebody to tell me what to do because like my whole job is like telling other people the way things should be, and it can be helpful to kind of like invert that.
Thank you. We have 2 new questions. Chris is asking, were there any paths you explored for branching out that didn't work out? When did you decide it wasn't for you versus knowing it's part of a learning curve?
Ooh, that's a really good one. I mean, I will say that at some point I was heavily considering becoming a cartoonist. And then I recognized that I needed dental insurance, and I was like, okay, cool. Not that, not that. So yeah, I also do think that like with games, I'm always like exploring and I'm trying to understand like what is my relationship to video games, and like do I, like how deeply do I want my foot in that bathtub? Like there's different, there's different options. So yeah, that's a thing that I'm always exploring and digging into. But yeah, for me, sometimes the consideration comes down to, yeah, like am I able to get dental insurance? Like, am I able to, like if I work on this full time, like how am I gonna feel? I'm trying to think of other examples of things that I tried. I mean, I was actually considering also going into traditional graphic design, and again, like books are kind of dead. Magazines, well, books aren't that dead. Books are great. But yeah, magazines are having a weird time. Condé Nast is having a weird time. And I just realized from the internships I did at that time, like, I don't know if this is for me. I think I like technology. So definitely explored a couple of different career options and kind of narrowed into user experience and interaction design as something I really like.
And do you have any advice for students to set boundaries and carve out time to recharge when we feel desperate to prove ourselves to prospective employers?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. I really like the idea of getting really focused on what you're trying to say, that you like who you are and what you do. Like how do you craft your brand? But like actually like the things that the things that I did when I was a student is, I mean, I really tried to like figure out what my like how I was going to communicate and like pitch myself as a creative person. I did not do free work because I couldn't afford to do free work. So that was like one of my rules, is like I am not going to work for free, and that was just like a boundary I had to set because I could not afford to work for free. So I am like a person who can say like you can set boundaries and still find great jobs. I think that for me, what it came down to as a student was showing that I was really excited about the work and that I was actively looking to learn. And that is what a lot of employers are looking for. They want to see somebody who has a lot of potential. And potential doesn't mean that you're, like going onto medium.com or Dribbble and like doing like a redesign of an existing user interface. That's one way maybe, but it can also, look like writing some deep thoughts about something that's really important to you, and then being able to talk about that and say, hey, I'm CATT, and I'm really passionate about the intersection of people, relationships, and digital experiences. Being able to communicate what you do is great. And so I think that my personal recommendation is to figure out your lines of like, what's really important to you? What are you excited about? What can you talk about for like hours on end? And then what are your hard passes? And I suggest one of those be free work.
Kind of a related question. What do you do when someone not from your department belittles you when you set boundaries for the scope of the work, especially when you're sure about the boundaries?
Yeah. I mean, I've for sure had situations like that where it's like people don't get it, and it can be pretty hard. I've had to check in with my values a lot of times throughout the different work that I've done. And what I can say is that it is important to put space between you and people who don't get it when you are able to. I've also found it helpful to just to like kind of, I don't know, you have to like remind yourself that this person doesn't get you and that you are very different people. And what I've usually done is I've just done what I can to kind of get through the class or get through the experience and then get out of there. I know that it's not possible all of the time to do that, but yeah, like my personal experience has been just deliver what the person asks, if they're a teacher, for example, and then get on out of there as soon as you can. Remember that they're different from you and that they're not right and they don't understand you. They're not right about you, they don't get you, and that's kind of the way it is, unfortunately. But yeah, trying not to take that personally and just seeing that, they don't understand you, trying to have, not empathy for them, but you know what I mean? Like, just not seeing it as a bad thing about yourself is really important. So separating the person's opinions about you from you as a human being.
And as a last question, and to open it up a little bit, I would really love to know what you are hopeful or passionate or very interested about regarding either the game industry or the UX community or game UX, whatever angle you prefer to.
Yeah, I am super happy to answer that. Also, I just want to say, if a person's like bullying you, by the way, and they're like a teacher or something, you should like report them if that's a thing you feel comfortable doing, just saying. Anyway, moving on to excitement. I mean, I'm super excited by seeing how many UX practitioners there are here. Like, that is something that I've been like watching from the side of my eyes, like, wow, like it's really cool to see this. I'm definitely very excited about accessibility. I'm excited to see like more design systems thinking over time. So the fact that we were seeing people talking about like cohesion between the game UI, like the contents of the game and like the UI that is around the game, like those are for sure things that I'm super interested in seeing. I think more broadly, I'm interested in seeing, different business models of game studios, things of that nature, and how we can, for example, make sure that we're having user research and like testing in these smaller studios. So those are things that I'm pretty curious about and very excited to see.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much again, Kat, for
Thank
being
you.
here. So
Thank you all. It's so nice.